So, hello everyone. Welcome to another week of the Museums Without Walls online seminar. Museums Without Walls is an ongoing exploration of virtual art institutions and communities, and it is currently supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, by Queen University, by the Screen Cultures and Curatorial Studies program, and the Agnes Etherington Arts Center. For this stage of the project, a Museum Without Walls has been physically hosted at Queen's University in Ontario. And it's always worth remembering that, just like many museums across the world, Queen's University is situated on unceded land in the ancestral home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And this is our fourth or fifth week, depending on how you count. And we have been organizing this online seminar as a way to accommodate extra presentations of researchers and artists who couldn't come to our original conference in August here at Kingston. And it has been quite an interesting experience. Today, our topic is performing collections. And in a way, we'll be discussing collections as archive with their own internal logic, or as a way to reproduce certain logics, but also how objects in a collection might be instantiated and presented in many different ways by an institution, or maybe outside of an institution even. And I feel that there is also sort of another side of this conversation that connects all presentations that relates to agency, the public agency, the role of audiences, and how much they can play in the power structure, how much power they can have in the structure of public institutions of art and cultural institutions. And as usual, we'll start by introducing our guests and also accounting for the absence. But in any case, today with us, we have Ashley Lanni, a museum studies and archival management study student at the University of Toronto. She has previously worked as an amateur archivist and exhibit researcher at the Concordia Center for Digital and Oral Storytelling and the Montreal Holocaust Museum. Prior to entering the museum and archival world, she studied the ways in which Soviet Russia sold their idea of the ideal Soviet to the world at global exhibitions. Outside of academia, she focuses on social justice and writing and hopes to explore the emerging intersection of video games and public education. Then we have Stéphanie Bertrand, a Canadian curator and researcher based in Greece. Over the past 15 years, she has organized exhibitions and participated in artistic and research projects in North and South America and in Europe. She holds a PhD from the School of Architecture at Aristotle University, Thessaloniki, and an MFA curating from Goldsmiths College, London. She has been awarded the Commonwealth Scholarship, Onassis Foreigners Fellowship, and Hannah Arendt Prize in Critical Theory and Creative Research. She's currently completing a Marie Curie Global Postdoctoral Fellowship on Virtual Museums and Contemporary Art at Milieu Institute for the Arts, Culture, and Technology at Concordia University, and the Institute of Computer Science at the Foundation for Research and Technology, ELAS, Heraklion. She is the author of Contemporary Curating, Artistic Reference and Public Reception, Reconsidering Inclusion, Transparency, and Mediation in Exhibition Making Practice, published by Routledge. And also with us today, we have Rosalind Bon, master, who has a background in cultural analysis and is currently a lecturer in television and cross-media culture at the University of Amsterdam. Her academic interests revolve around smartphone cultures, urban screens, and increasing integration of social media logic in physical spaces. She often connects her professional experience as digital creative and travel blogger to her research into transmedia forms of storytelling. And Rosalind was actually meant to participate, and in a way, her work is part of our previous panel on on institutional leaks. Was it? I mean, things are starting to get a bit messy in my head. But she couldn't come for the conversation last Thursday, so she's here with us today. And that's great because sadly we have 2 or 3 absences. Some of our presenters from Vietnam didn't even send the presentation, and we haven't heard from them in a while. And Hoyetse, even though her video is already up on our YouTube channel, couldn't come today because she had connection problems. In any case, I'm sure you have an amazing conversation, and there's lots that we can discuss also about the other projects that we have seen here, since in a way the conversation or this seminar is uh, an, a layering, an accumulation of topics. And yeah, a lot of the questions that we'll be addressing have been with us even before the conference we had in August. Anyway, thanks so much, all presenters for today. And as usual, I'll start with some very specific questions so that we can start the conversation somewhere. First to Ashley, who presented on the Museum for Contemplation, a comparative study between Imagine Monet and the Musée l'Orangerie Water Lilies. And I found a very fascinating presentation because it draws from a more, let's say, analog idea of immersion. And right now, I think it's more or less the same case with Museum Without Walls. We have all these definitions of virtuality and virtual reality, and sometimes the effect that you manage to get with these new media is not as powerful as the one you had with perhaps simpler techniques and simpler tools. And I think that one of the things that really interested me was the role of the artist itself, in that case, Monet, in thinking of this space. And I was wondering, because that also reminded me of Rothko's Cathedral and other such spaces that sometimes, and what's the name of the guy that uses lighting? And I'm just embarrassing myself. Terrell, thanks so much, Fran. Great research assistant. I'm just embarrassing myself right here, right now. But in any case, it's very fascinating how the artist already played a role that's curatorial and has to do with exhibition design. And sometimes this is required by the work. And my question was more related to this and how this, in a way, in the case of this piece specifically of the water lilies, it also has to do with this kind of isolation or creation of a space that is, in a way, separated from the urban space. And in that sense, maybe a very modern gesture.
Absolutely. I think there's this sense of disconnect is a negative word. I think that I'm trying not to use it, but it's a refuge, right? It's meant to be a refuge from the city. And I think that's something very powerful that you can find in urban museums. And they often sort of, especially immersive ones, tend to advertise as a break almost from the reality of your world. And it's difficult because I know for a lot of more immersive displays, they tend to, like with Imagine Monet or even Imagine Van Gogh, you can't get the artist's intention there, right? Like they are not involved; they're long past being present. Um, Whereas L'Orangerie, he was able to give his input. Yes, it was fully installed after his death, but he was involved in that development process, so his vision could come to life. Um, and I think that's maybe something that obviously we are very lucky with contemporary art, and I'm sure that my fellow co-panelists will have a lot more to say about this than I do, is that you can get more of the artist's intention there, their sort of focus. They have more of the potential to create a narrative, whereas anything with the masters from the past, well, it's all up to the curator in the present to sort of interpret or create a story there. Um, but I do love this idea of taking a step back from the world and sort of being centered in something different and something new. And I think there is a lot of potential for it to work in both a digital and analog way. It does require obviously a lot of different efforts if you do it with analog and a lot of other construction, I think. Um, Digital is a bit easier because you can sort of work with screens. There's a lot of potential there. But again, like I said in my presentation, it all really sort of hinges on this idea of what are you trying to get out of the audience? How are they engaging with this environment? And if they just feel like they're walking through a gallery and then walking out, well, is that, yes, it's a break from maybe what their regular day to day is, but is it actually showing them anything different, anything very, very memorable? Um, so yeah, there's a lot to work with here, and I'd love to get Stephanie and Rosalind's ideas about this, just because obviously you both deal with agency in very different contexts than these. So um, maybe I'll use this to sort of just jump to another question that I have, and I'll direct it at Rosalind first, because I've been seeing more and more of these sort of Instagrammable spaces in museums, especially. And I'm not as familiar with the U Museum, obviously, but how do you think that these like Instagram spaces, because they are meant to be ephemeral, they're meant to sort of almost mimic what we would do in real life, but in such a grandiose way. How did they add to this element of immersion from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to link both our topics and interests. Yeah, the idea of immersion is, of course, when I was also watching your presentation, my first thought was like, how is it quite immersing the visitor, right? Because it's still very much, like you say, screen based, to the point where my concerns with the museum being, is it art? Is there even art still there? Is it still something we consider to be any activity associated with art? I was thinking, yeah, the screens in your example invite almost even less of an interaction, right? And of course, we can't kind of put apples and pears and compare them in the same way, but I kept thinking of, yeah, like this is so interesting in terms of the interactivity and the immersion is there to some extent in terms of that feeling of awe being created. There is certain affect that's being invited in some way, especially with, okay, we've got visuals, but we have more senses being engaged with in terms of the music or the background sounds that we're hearing. So it's kind of going more towards affect theory and the affective experience there of the visitors in terms of, okay, there is some interaction, but it's almost, apart from the sound that was added, it's almost more retinal than what I feel like the Instagram museums are doing, because there at least there is some invitation of the body, like tactile interaction as well. So yeah, I'm not quite sure what to make of it yet, but these were definitely questions that were popping up in my mind as well. Like, there is some immersion happening in this way and some immersion happening in this context, but if one is more inviting towards the audience in terms of having agency to create narrative across those pieces, I couldn't say, to be honest, which one engages more in that sense. So what were you thinking about that type of, okay, immersion also being part of that interactive element that you would expect?
I think you touched on something really fascinating when you said haptic. It hit a part of my brain that mostly was my old kind of history brain. But there is something nice, something very real about it. And I think he also kind of touches on this too. And unfortunately, she's not here today. But there's something about touching things that makes them very real, that makes you feel very present, right? And it's very true that the retinal aspect, and I'm sorry for my dog if you can hear him in the background, he's very active. Um, that retinal aspect does feel very detached, and that's how I felt in this space, because I had gone to imagine Monet expecting this grand experience, and the only thing I could really touch was something to sit on. And it's like, okay, this is nice. It's a rock. I am here in the garden, I guess. Um, but there is something about these Instagram museums that do feel, there's almost like a magical sense to them. I've seen pictures that come out of these places, and yes, they're very manufactured, but um, the haptic aspect does feel very grounded, and I need to go to one, clearly, is the conclusion I've gotten from this. But I'm also in the early stages of trying to piece this all together and trying to kind of figure it out. And um, so much of my previous work was sort of, as was mentioned earlier in the intro, like centered on like Soviet projections to the West and how they did that with physical objects, interestingly enough. And um, when they did this, you couldn't exactly touch the objects, but like you were very kind of present beside them, and that made a certain realness to it that just seeing a picture on a wall, it doesn't really. So yeah, it's a lot of me rambling to say I'm also not sure, but I see where you're going with it, and I'm very fascinated by the haptic as well.
I think that's the moment to ramble. So don't worry at all about that. When you're talking, I started thinking also about not literally the haptic sense, but how there is some tactility to paintings that you only or that you often realize when you see them in person, but not in reproductions. And that's something also that invites a more complex relationship to the object as you move closer and farther away from it. And there's kind of this process of synthesis of the picture, you know. And maybe this feeling of presence of the other as the object is also particularly powerful in terms of creating a sense of being in another world or environment that most projection and digital media doesn't have. So, but at the same time, and this also connects to, well, Instagram museums and to the general idea of stratification or maybe the crystallization of certain canons, because more and more, perhaps due to social media, what prevails in our collective imaginations is very often what is easily or what looks good in reproductions. And I think that's part of the problem underlying what Stéphanie brought in her presentation, recruiting collective intelligence to level art world stratification, a potential impact of virtual museums of contemporary art. And that's something that I always felt in my own research field that also involve repositories of 3D scans made by people. And you see that people, they scan what they already want to scan, what's already in a way famous. And Stéphanie, I thought that the idea of maybe moving beyond taste and closer to perhaps modes of interpretation can be a really, smart way to get people to think differently and maybe get some other impressions of them or ways of organizing and archiving things. And I was more curious to see how you have implemented this so far, if you have, and what exactly do you expect at this moment?
Thanks for your question. No, I haven't. My work right now is quite speculative. I mean, it is based on curatorial experience and what works in a gallery and what afterwards might be translated into an algorithm to support certain effects within the system. I hope to get funding past my postdoc to be able to actually realize this. It is based, my proposal is based on empirical research, but there is one main hypothesis that still needs to be proved, and that has to do with if you're given a choice between two possible readings, for instance, that are captured by two different works, are you going to choose the work that you like most, or are you going to choose the reading or the interpretation that is most meaningful to you? And there's actually been research in choice theory where with very basic stimuli, so artworks are quite sophisticated stimuli, but with quite basic visual stimuli, when people were asked to choose between two very basic images, they didn't necessarily choose their favorite, though. And that presupposes that with the right maybe curatorial infrastructure, that maybe we can move away from just this kind of gut reaction of liking things towards trying to have a metric or a measure for what is meaningful to people. Because, you know, maybe I like Van Gogh, but that says nothing about my belief system or about, you know, why that's meaningful to me. Maybe I just like it because everybody else likes it and because I know he's a famous artist. So I'm trying to look at how we can use online collections to do other things, to give other kinds of agencies, to come back to the term that you used earlier, to the public. But, you know, I think there's a sense right now that given agency is just deferring institutional authority to the public. But that also defers responsibility. I think the institution always has a responsibility, a certain accountability. You can't just defer everything and be like, hey, let's all be content, the museum's opening its doors and you guys can all be content creators and produce whatever, and we're just going to put it on view. I think that there's a tension between having to still uphold a kind of particular worldview or a particular set of values and meanings for the rest of society, and balancing that out with giving the public and users a lot more say in content, or in you know, how value is being determined, in the case of the paper that I presented on for this talk. This takes us in a really different direction than the discussion that originally got started out, but I was just trying to answer your question.
No, it's a great answer, and I don't think it does really, because I think that, well, questions of immersion, they relate very much to that gut feeling that you were just talking about. And maybe to go back to the question of the Instagram museum, or the Instagramization of museums, I could see when some works started to get more and more popular because of social media. And I'm thinking specifically of Yaoi Kusama's installations, for example. And I think I've been to the first exhibition at the Tate maybe 10 years ago, or maybe even more, and how it became super, well, a phenomenon, really. And I guess that creates this kind of feedback loop. And in the end, we're talking about some sort of gut reaction of the audience, both to the space itself and to this possibility of inscribing themselves, your body, in this amazing image that circulates and then becomes an object of desire. Being there becomes an object of desire for other people as well. So
if I could just add something, I mean, for me, the more, like, I guess I tend to stick to more visual or 2D media, or and to online collections of, you know, art digitizations, but really images of artworks, like pretty classic archival stuff. Because in a way, I'm suspicious of the increasing move to recruit more and more of our senses. Like suddenly, you know, immersive technologies is not just a visual and audio media. More and more, it's going to smell, it's going to taste, it's going to touch. And the more senses you start to control or limit my kind of affordances, or determine how I'm going to act in you know, within a particular technologically mediated environment, the more I feel like it's actually lessening my agency. I have no kind of step back. If you put a particular smell, I'm going to have particular memories. I feel that with the visual, I always have a distance. I'm afforded a distance. and for me, if I'm less solicited bodily, I guess I feel like I can have more judgment on what's going on, no? But I know a lot of people feel differently. They feel that the more you're fully involved, fully embodied, the more agency you have. And that seems to be the dominant trend, whereas I actually feel the other way. I remember being at a granular synthesis concert like 20 years ago, and the bass was so loud I couldn't breathe anymore. I felt like I had zero agency, that if they kept turning up the bass, I would just suffocate. And I mean, there I felt like I had zero agency. I couldn't even get up. It's in that sense where maybe I'm suspicious of immersive technologies taking over more and more of our senses.
And that's an interesting comment. I think I'm also suspicious perhaps of the multimediaification of everything, but at the same time, there is this kind of sensorial bias in culture in general that favors the visual, sometimes because it allows us this distance, this distanced attitude, this analytical attitude, whereas it's more complex to deal with sound, precisely because qualities such as the pressure that the bass provokes is not easy to reproduce anywhere. You have to be in certain technological and architectural conditions to feel it. And I mean, even smells. And in that sense, we are also talking about the limitations of our technology in terms of how it represents certain art forms or and certain media even. So I think it is really worth considering, and it should definitely inform the kind of tools we are using to think about collections and in a way, yeah, in the sense that it's certainly more convenient today to start the problem with visual media, because that's maybe the core of our problem really, and what dominates the discourse. And I lost my train of thought.
Yeah, no, maybe it's a good moment. I wanted to add a thought there. Since it's something you also brought up, Gabriel, in terms of we're all dealing with all of our topics and also just the affordances of, or even just the limits of the technology that we are using today, or the bias of our technology. All of us are talking about art reproduced, whether that's art reproduced on social media or art created to be reproduced on social media, whether that's art in a digital collection where you view it reproduced right on your screen, or whether that's in Ashley's case, it is on the screen as well reproduced. And I think our key mode of reproduction for these things is still very much with a visual bias, right? Of course, we're talking mostly about the visual arts in any case, but also the idea of reproduction, I think, is still so much based on that ability of visually at least reproducing the art, whereas there's texture of art, whether that's in a haptic sense or just also seeing the texture of it and seeing it in three-dimensional shape. I would say I'm thinking of the two-dimensionality of the reproduction of art still that we have to deal with. I mean, even right now on Zoom, right, it's a 2D type of interaction that we're having with each other and with the presentations and with the way the arts in our presentations was presented. So I think this idea about the senses, it just fascinates me very much in terms of, to what sense is that just a natural occurrence for the museum where art is brought in to be viewed? To what extent is that something that we can embrace and decide to focus on? But to what extent do we also perhaps want to anticipate how much our technology will evolve and bring in more possibilities for sound or other types of senses? Because I was struck by Stéphanie's comments in terms of memory as well, because I recognize the idea of smell and sound and the immediacy of memory there. But I think we've just been very trained to look at things and I don't know quite where I'm getting at, but I recognize the idea of, okay, visually, I'm not as grasped by memories as easily, perhaps because we are so used to seeing other people's perspectives visually through art. Sorry, that was just rambling. I don't have a question to follow that one.
But in a way, I think it. Sorry, Ashley, go ahead.
No. If you want to start your thought and finish it, I'll jump in right after. It's all good.
Okay. I think it kind of connects to the question that I was going to pose you. I think that, yes, maybe because visuality is already super codified, and this makes it easier to, deal with it, but at the same time, it makes it harder for it to empower us. And maybe that's why it doesn't take over our memory with the same kind of strength that other senses. But my question was maybe also more tactical, because your presentation kind of asks us to pay more attention and respect more the audiences and the Instagram museums themselves, because there's something going on there. And I was wondering how other kinds of museums and institutions that might not be connected to art, and I think that's more or less the framework that we're trying to address here, could engage with the same or similar strategies in order to convoke the public collective intelligence in a way, and have them participating more actively in how culture is reproduced, represented, and or they themselves are reproduced and represented. Because our gut reaction to Instagram museums from a critical thinking point of view is that what's happening here? This is spectacle, pure shallow spectacle. It's like, anyway, if you have any insights that could help us museums to survive.
Yeah, I mean, very valid question. It was, to be honest, it was my gut reaction as well. And even walking around it, I felt half fascinated, half ironically engaging with it. And it's interesting because, of course, it's a business model before anything else, I feel like. At the same time, people very genuinely engage with it. We do genuinely co-create it in terms of it being informed by social media cultures in the first place, and then feeding back into it. Of course, I feel that in some ways it has to be in conversation with the public a lot more, and at the same time, it's nudges that conversation towards corporate interests all the time, and that's something we can lament, of course, something that we should critique. I think we should continue to critique and be very aware of. But we tend to be very wary of newer concepts like that while ignoring the very questionable business models that underlie museums, and the very questionable, hierarchy of agency in terms of determining, I think, as Stéphanie also touched upon in her presentation very concretely, the very questionable division of value within those collections, and what we want to see, and who determines what we see, who determines what we think is worth seeing. And at least with, well, I wouldn't say at least, because of course we have corporate interests feeding into that for the Instagram museum as well. But in some way, I see some value in terms of how it has to stay in conversation with those social media cultures, informing it in the first place, where there is at least some agency from the public in terms of what is, at least it is kind of a collective mass popular opinion, of course, not to claim in any sense that it's representative of underrepresented voices, because I don't think an Instagram museum is the place where that happens at all. It is, I think there's an interesting aspect in terms of kind of co-creation and sociality, where the essence of the Instagram museum in the first place is that it needs to cater to the public's tastes and interests to some extent.
Rosalind, maybe this is a little bit unfair, but do you have any stats on the audience of the museum, like whether I'm not sure what year it opened, and I'm not thinking about the pandemic, but I'm thinking like, do these, you talked in your presentation, I think, about these types of spaces just popping up all over the world.
Yes.
Is there any kind of like is the novelty effect of them wearing off, or is it just picking up? I know that we mentioned the Kusama. I was in
Yes.
Montreal this summer, and I tried to get tickets to go see the Kusama show, and they were sold out within 1 hour.
Yeah.
And I didn't end up being able to go see them. Like, all the tickets for the month had sold out within an hour, and I know it was the same when she showed at Tate Modern. No? And so I'm wondering, in comparison to Kusama, where there's this kind of rise that I think is due to very much Instagram culture, where in comparison are these Instagram museums, maybe the novelty effect of them is maybe wearing off, or not.
Yeah.
Where are we at?
Yeah, so I have to be honest, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think there's something I could say there. I think generally they're still considered quite novel spaces. People are still kind of like, it's a known phenomenon to most younger people at this point, but it's still considered a newish phenomenon that's worth going to at least once, right? Or visiting. With kids, I've also seen, interestingly, I've seen a lot of people discussing it in the context of, oh, it's great to spend time with your teen who doesn't want to spend time with you normally. Or like, you could like bring your kids and they could play in the ball pit, and you'll have them entertained for a while, and then mom and dad can take some pictures too. So in some way, it's also kind of, there's this crossover to playground-esque spaces as well, and that's of course the theme park type of entertainment that also underlies these places. So in that way, somehow I find it's found some more stability in that way, in terms of providing to that type of demographic just urban, an additional type of playground space in the urban realm, but also like younger adults who want to be influencers, or who like to be very active in social media. I do still see them interacting with these spaces, and I see these spaces doing pop-up events to remain relevant to some extent. But I think it's interesting to think about this in terms of what sparked it, of course, was museums, or more established museums, having certain exhibitions or installations going viral. And that's, of course, what even sparked these types of startup ideas to start creating their own playground-esque spaces that in a way they're all mimicking that viral exhibition in those established museums. I think it will probably start departing a little bit more from that model, but I think that is initially, of course, what drove the business ideas behind these museums popping up in different places.
In that sense,
your question.
yeah. No, in that sense, it just occurred to me that I can find it for you if you want. There was a study, I don't know if you came across it, of how what kind of Instagram pictures people take at the Hermitage Museum.
Yes.
And they're all the same shots. So
Yeah,
like they
yeah.
fall into 3 categories, and people naturally gravitate and reproduce the same shots.
Yes.
So it really spills over into maybe more highbrow institutions.
Yeah, it certainly does. It's this Instagram worthiness of certain I mean, even because I've been working in the travel industry for a while as well, you see this in the tourism industry so much, in terms of certain spots in cities becoming like insufferable to live in, because there's this one specific photo or this one specific shot that it just catches our attention and we need to reproduce it. It's the same in the fashion industry. It's this one item that goes viral and everybody must buy it, and it'll become reproduced into dupes by so many. And there's just this very human quality in terms of spreadability and virality, which sparks something in the museum industry that we can find connections to in the tourism industry, in all these creative sectors where there is an innate quality in the human audience, I would say, that something they see that they really like, they need to have reproduced for some reason.
Ironically, even 15 years ago, when I was doing my master's in London, we were talking about the fact that all the collectors back then wanted a Damien Hirst spot painting. And the more he churned them out, the more the value rose as opposed to flatten out, because all the collectors needed to have one in their collections. And instead of devaluating the others, it would actually
inflate
raise
it.
our value.
Yeah, exactly. It's what
I don't know where they're at now. I don't know whether that's still true, but I know the market perpetuates itself, or
and you mentioned in your presentation as well, right? The stuff that's popular will just continue to get more popular. And I think it's especially this wave that's being that they're riding with these museums, with these Instagram museums as well. It's really just that's what it's capitalizing on, not the art itself in the end.
It brings up something really interesting because you're both kind of touching on the social aspect, right? It's like a part of human nature, this desire to have what everybody else has or to sort of imitate. And one of the things that sort of really struck me from this conversation and from your work, Stephanie, was that also, like, we talk about it in a very negative way, but there is this potential for positive, right? Like in the Instagram museum, maybe you could have social encounters between people who would never really speak with each other. I don't know if that actually happens. I'm curious if it does, right? And Stephanie, in a similar way, like you talked about kind of this pathfinding and like creating these alternative narratives. I wonder then, I'm going to start with, I guess, Stephanie as a question and then they kind of expanded from there. If this pathfinding, if this like type of alternative curation could then be shared with the public in order to like have this positive like imitation effect. And I wonder if it could, I don't know if that would be sincere is also the problem. Maybe if it were to happen in the Instagram museum, for example, if you saw this encounter between people, if people would go out of their way to recreate it. But maybe the general question is there the chance for this to be used in a positive way, this like social need to imitate, to sort of bring community together maybe? What do you both think?
I don't think it applies in what I'm proposing, or I don't see how it, well, that's not exactly true. In the model that I'm proposing, or the use that I'm proposing, or of online collections, eventually, I haven't figured this part out yet, because it does rely on actually building a prototype, but eventually I think it's a model that tries to materialize what is known in the art world as the infinite conversation. So going to I usually go to the museum on my own. I know a lot of people do it as a social experience, like they'll go with family and friends and they'll discuss what they see, but it's always in a smaller group. And certain apps now like Smartify are trying to build that sociality in so that you can find other people looking at visiting the same exhibition online as you are, and have conversations with them. I don't know whether that's actually going to happen, or take off, but I'm interested in, if you pick a particular path through, that you'd be able to see what somebody else, what the choices of somebody else were, and how yours differ, and to learn about yourself. So for me, I think the built-in reward is less sociality. It's more about self-awareness in this particular case. So that's the kind of gratification you get from comparing yourself or your choices to what the choices that somebody else would make, and having access to that, and what that tells you about yourself in comparison to other people. But it's not the same type of sociality and kind of reward that you get from community. So in my model, it doesn't quite go there. I think maybe more what you were describing as strangers actually physically coming together at this maybe Instagram model museum.
We have a question in the chat, Phil. If you want to ask it out loud, I think it makes more sense.
Yeah, sure. I guess there's two questions. I'm just listening to all of you speak, and it's fascinating maybe to hear that, you know, things like highbrow and lowbrow are always blending into each other, or distinctions can't really be maintained. That's how the tone of the conversation feels like it's going. So apologies for listening to almost the cadence rather than the content sometimes. But I'm curious about this invocation of human nature in the past conversation, and what we want to mean by human nature, and how immovable, how universal is human nature. Because we're discussing sort of the artistic side of things, but on the psychological, humanistic side, what exactly are we smuggling in with this idea of human nature? And it'll probably be different for each of you. But I just wanted to hear more elaboration on what the human is.
Well, I think in my case, so when I talk about human nature, I would talk about, you know, kind of cognitive biases and heuristics that we have when we perceive the world, that some of which are socially ingrained, others that are personal and come from our experiences. And that's the side that I'm interested in connecting how, because art is often quite ambiguous, and we can read it in very different ways, and what we pay attention to varies from one person to the next. So I am interested in the psychology of it, of what it reveals about what I pay attention to, how I connect things together in my day-to-day life, what that says about me. That's a side, you know, why is this meaningful to me, whereas it's not for somebody else? So that's, and how does curating facilitate that, or somehow sets that up? That's been my interest, or I guess that's how I tend to refer to human nature. I know at some point in the paper that underlies my talk, I talk about the collective phenomenon of preferential attachment, and I talk about it being a kind of innate human tendency where we tend to support superstars as opposed to underdogs. So even though we like to think that we root for the underdogs, if you know, if there's a restaurant that's full next to a restaurant that's empty, you're gonna want to go eat at the restaurant that's full. And we do this everywhere. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's how I understand it when I talk about it. It's really about kind of most some socially built-in, some biologically built-in tendencies that we have towards certain perceptions, certain biases, certain connections that we make.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think especially the first half of your answer, it was you managed to answer without giving human nature a content. It was like difference. You know, you allowed space for difference, which was really nice. But then, yeah, I'm just curious about when the innateness comes in. That innateness of like choosing the full over the empty restaurant. I think there's also maybe a mechanism in human nature where people are like, I'm not going to choose the full restaurant. I'm going to rebel against my nature and choose the thing that I normally wouldn't choose, or that wouldn't be natural to choose. So that, no, I'm sorry, I've just read too much Nietzsche, so I'm thinking about value a lot, and this conversation is really powerful around value. But to what extent does human nature have a mechanism for perverting its own innateness, I guess, is a question that I had. and how does that relate to these Instagram museums, and kind of, yeah, our own sense of value around them as well. But we don't have to take up more space with that. I thought that was a really interesting answer.
Well, I mean, you know, human nature is also like, there's research that has come out that if we all hear the same story, even if we're in different physical places, our hearts all get synced up. There are things that are biologically ingrained in us that come from certain evolutionary phenomenon. There are things that are socially determined. There are things that for sure have to do with our own personal memories and backgrounds. And all those things get, you know, they push and pull. Sometimes they're in conflict, sometimes they're aligned. And then that creates opportunities for agency, but also manipulation. Because I think that a lot of these big tech companies are looking into, you know, are hiring people who are experts in psychophysics, in psychology, in making sure that they push the right buttons to get the reactions that to maintain our attention, to maintain our and to be able to monetize it. Though, so I mean, it's nice that you know, you can decide to take a certain stand or to rebel against an instinct you might have, and I think we all do that in certain cases. But I think in a discussion of technology and how that mediates culture and how it mediates participation, then we need to be aware of that, though.
Yeah, on a similar or a different but perhaps related note, I just wanted to go back to Ashley's presentation, because in a way we have been really outlining some sort of contrast here that kind of goes in the line of the highbrow versus lowbrow, or the original versus the reproduction. But I was wondering, how much do these spectacular exhibitions, such as Imagine Monet or Imagine Van Gogh, or any of the other ones that have become popular in the last few years, they aren't like maybe some sort of necessary evil to preserve the work in some way, to kind of multiply the work in popular culture and in popular imagination at the same time, which might not be the best way to frame this. But I was just considering, also going back to the idea that the Instagram museum might be more interesting than it seems at first. What do you think in terms of considering the relation between Imagine Monet and the water lilies, not as a contrast, but perhaps as a continuum of the same kind of information or the same kind of object distributed across different instances?
Well, it's interesting because your earlier comment, or the earlier part of what you were saying, is something that has come up a lot in reviews of the exhibits, actually. Just this, for people who are not familiar, who may have heard about it but never seen it, it is a chance to be introduced to the work, right? So you are right, and I think we do need these spaces to introduce there's a particular word that I am forgetting here, but the inexperienced viewer, I guess, right? It sort of teaches them, this is this other world that you have never seen. Here's a chance to see as much of it as possible. I think, and I mentioned this in the presentation, but I think one of the weaknesses of it is it just doesn't give you a chance to fully appreciate all of them, because it just shows you everything all at once, right? And you don't necessarily get the chance to be there with it and to think about the human aspect of it, the human connection, which maybe ties to the human nature question of before, of what do we want out of these spaces, and maybe some of it is a desire to sort of, yeah, see yourself a little bit in them, or see maybe a part of the world that you can feel a connection to. And I guess what's maybe different from what I've seen of like Instagrammable spaces is that they're kind of immutable in a way. Like there is like you can move them around, yes, but there is a certain kind of consistency to the space, and you can be in it for as long as you want to and then leave. Whereas in these Imagine exhibits, you get this constant shifting that happens. But going back to what you were saying, it is accurate. Maybe it is a necessary evil to be an avenue to where we are going in the future. There's a corporate element to it that was kind of mentioned earlier, in that this is a good way for museums to make money. People who have heard of Monet and want to see him, or have heard of Van Gogh and want to see his work, they get to go and they get to see it. And that way the museum stays afloat and can maybe reinvest that money in different ways. So there are a lot of benefits, even though maybe I was a bit more negative about it in the paper than I needed to be. But yeah, I think there are a lot of positives to be taken away from here. And the least of which is maybe sort of saying, hey, people, this is something new.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, what I think is really interesting at the moment in terms of we're thinking a lot about traditional visual art pieces that are singular in some sense, right? Have this aura of authenticity. I mean, I don't want to reference Walter Benjamin and reproducibility too much, but it's interesting, right? In terms of the age where we are at now, in terms of we have this archive. If we think of it in terms of archive, we have our archive of physical existing artworks, and people will of course keep reproducing that type of art as well. But we're going, well, of course, with like digital art, NFTs, and all those spaces of art that also problematic in their own way. But thinking in terms of the digital arts piece that may be in essence will be able to be reproduced, and we might be able to show those simultaneously in different locations. This is probably what we would be moving towards. I was thinking in terms of, okay, these types of exhibitions that are screen-based, immersive exhibitions is in a way access to the digital archive in a different way than just staring at your laptop screen. But I think at the same time will probably become more of a standard as art evolves to include digital origins of art a lot more, at least of visual art. So yeah, I think we probably can't get stuck in comparing the traditional museum space and then kind of always contrasting it to spaces like these. I think what we'll be moving towards is different types of access to the archive, but then probably also different types of seeing the original, I guess. If the original even has any value or meaning, I don't know, in like 50 years, that probably will be a very different, have a very different type of aura surrounding it. So yeah, I think there's much potential to all of these spaces. I think we're just seeing the beginning phases of more decentralized, distributed forms of accessing art, I guess. It's hard for me to find the phrases right now to describe it, but I do feel like we're kind of in this zone towards new ways of interacting with art and viewing art pieces in general, not just in terms of archival, the idea of the archival, the archive and the art.
Well, I don't know if Stephanie wants to respond to that as well, but I'll just get it right in my own question and maybe follow it up, since we are about time, to ask the three of you also if you have any final words or what's the stage of your projects right now and perhaps next steps. And we can start with Stephanie.
No, I think I'll let Rosalind have the last word on it. She did a good job. My next step, I'm presenting at European Research Night. I'm presenting my research next week. I'm going to be presenting this paper also at the Museum Computer Group's annual conference in London. And I'm finishing my postdoc in January, and then we'll see. I'm still not sure, but I would like to try and get funding to actually test my ideas out. So to collaborate with computer scientists into actually seeing whether this works or it's purely speculative. I think I missed that side of curating where you're actually putting things together, but I need quite a lot of technical support to do that. So fingers crossed.
Rosalind, Ashley?
I can jump in very quickly. I think, Rosalind, you actually opened up a very interesting idea that I want to explore in terms of that reproducibility element and maybe people's reactions to it. I think that would be the next step of this, really, because a lot of this was taken from a theoretical perspective, right? And I'd love to sort of get more of the reactions from people who are in these exhibits and maybe why they go there, maybe more of their reactions, maybe exploring more of that affect element. I don't quite have a structure as of yet. It's very early days, but there are so many of these exhibits that are opening, like especially in Canada. Montreal has had a plethora of them, especially over the summer, like was mentioned. So it would be very interesting to go to more of them and to sort of explore, I guess, what I've seen already a little bit further and sort of going more towards the mindset of people, some more of the psychology and more of their reactions. But we'll see. That's sort of where I'm at right now, and otherwise school. Yay. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah, also thanks to you, Ashley, and to Stéphanie, and of course to Gabrielle as well, in terms of I think it was really great to also compare draw comparisons to different ways in terms of how digital art spaces may be evolving, and kind of see the connections between these different routes that museum-esque spaces are taking. So in that sense, I loved seeing those connections and talking to both of you. Very valuable. I think for me in the future, I'd like to turn this into some form of a paper to have published somewhere. That's something I'd like to be working on, which I have no real information on that just yet. So that's just something I'll keep working on. And in addition to that, I'm just very, very curious to see where these spaces are headed, also with where Instagram is headed, because Instagram is headed into a very different direction now as well, thanks to TikTok. So this business model needs to evolve, and it needs to do that pretty quickly, and I think it will. So I'm also just super interested to keep an eye on these spaces and see how this, I mean, because they're so platformized and they can quickly adapt, I'm actually excited to see how they will adapt and how that will change, again, the architecture of the city, because it is, of course, influencing the architecture of cities. So apart from just wishing to continue working on this and turning this into something publishable, I'm also just very interested to keep tabs on these spaces and see where they're headed to in the future. And if they start to evolve more into their own thing, or if they'll keep touching base with these blueprints that they borrow from museums, I'm just very interested to see if it's going to mutate into something else.
Yeah, I started to think about the TikTok museum now and what exactly this could be, and wow, future. Well, thanks so much, Ashley, Stephanie, and Rosalind. This was a great conversation. Our conversations have been so generative, and it always feels like when they start to get some traction, sadly, we must wrap up. But I mean, as you mentioned before, some of you are very late at night, so I hope that we can continue these conversations in other dimensions of Museums Without Walls. We're trying to perhaps make use of the Discord. Who knows, maybe we'll have a publication also to where some of these projects can be featured in the third stage of the project. So keep us posted about what you're doing. And once again, thanks so much to all of you, to all the audience, synchronous and asynchronous, that's watching this panel now. Next week, we have our final online activities for this round of Museums Without Walls, with a conversation about virtual galleries, actual institutions with Rob Staten from the Museum of Other Realities and Nivea Lolasco Rosas from the Beyond Matter project by the ZKM. So I hope to see you around. And for now, have a nice week. And yeah, take care.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.